Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one whom men hide their faces from, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was placed upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. We are all like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hands. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
All right. You know someone's heart when you know their deep desires and what satisfies them. And Isaiah 53 is such a beautiful passage because it gets right to the deep desire of God. It tells us what God desires and how the servant, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, satisfies that desires and really, it's just awesome. We'll get to that in a second. As we said before in the intro, 700 years before Christ actually comes into the world, God opened the eyes of his prophet Isaiah to see deep into the heart of God. And it shows us really one of the greatest doctrines in all of Christendom. In fact, if you don't get this doctrine right, you won't get any of the rest of Christianity right. And that is the doctrine that we call substitution. It's all about how the Messiah is pierced and crushed in our place, right? The righteous takes the place of the unrighteous. The loving shepherd takes the place of the lost sheep, and the exalted king takes the place of rebel subjects. And Isaiah knows a lot about this coming Messiah. He's called the servant. There's actually 4 different servant passages in the book of Isaiah. Originally, we were going to do all 4 of the servant passages, but decided to do the greatest hits and just take Isaiah 53 instead. And he doesn't know everything about the Messiah, but he knows 5 really important things, and I want to read those to you and tell a bit about that. First of all, Isaiah knows that every single one of us are rebel subjects, okay? We all disobey the exalted king. I want to give you a little bit of the setting that Isaiah is writing in, because if you know the history of Israel, you have Abraham, you had Isaac, you had Jacob, you have all of the extended family of Jacob going to Egypt. They multiply, 400 years pass, they become a huge people. They get taken out of Egypt. They wander through the desert. They go in the promised land. Then you have a series of judges, disobedience, God raising up judges to rescue them. They beg for a king. They finally get a king. They've got David. They've got Solomon. And then you have a series of disasters and disasters. So by the time you get to the Isaiah passage, you're in a period of Jewish history where there are two kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom where 10 of the tribes ended up conglomerating. And then there's the southern kingdom, which is where King David descended. That's the tribe of Judah and of Benjamin. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter whether they're northern or southern, because they're pretty much have all been bad. You've got 5 good kings out of 20-some in the southern kingdom, and every single king in the northern kingdom has just been rotten to the core. And so like the leadership, the not just the kings, but the priestly leadership, the people sort of follow, right? The leaders. And so they've just been disobedient to the core. Even though they hold on to the practices of Judaism, they might worship at the temple, they might follow some of the laws, they've added a lot of other stuff to it. They've become horrible, terrible, egregious idol worshipers. So Isaiah comes, and God gives a series of messages to Isaiah, and he's warning them over and over again, if you keep doing what you're doing, I'm going to send you all into exile. Nah, 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 I don't hear you, right? Over and over. In fact, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah are all about the disaster that's coming. Mixed in with all of this stuff about what's coming are other prophecies. Isaiah is writing about his own day. He prophesies about the near future. He prophesies about the exile. He prophesies about the coming of Christ, and he even prophesies some about what's going to happen when we go to heaven. So there's a lot going on in this book, but the main thing I wanted to tell you is just the idea that throughout it all is this overriding message of disobedience to the king. I wanted to kind of put it in a more modern context and give you an illustration that might, take it more to home. A few years ago, the Food and Drug Administration decided that we all needed to know the calories of the food that we were eating when we go out to eat, right? So some of you may have noticed when you went to any of the chain restaurants, so it could be a chain like the Olive Garden or Outback Steakhouse or that type of thing, or it could even be a chain like McDonald's or Jack in the Box or something like that. And so you'd walk in and you get the menu, and it told you the calorie count of every single thing you were eating. But what restaurants found out is the idea was behind it is if you knew how bad the food was that you were eating, that you wouldn't order that bad food, right? But that was not the case. People don't want to know the calories in the food that they're eating. We want to go on eating the bad food. So the way the restaurants have gotten around it today is they still have the calories, the menus with the calorie count, but you have to ask for that one special. The one you get in the restaurants now has all the food with it, which is normal. But if you say, can I see the menu with the calories, then by law they have to provide it. In other words, we're not listening, right? Because we don't want to hear what we don't want to hear. We don't want to see what we don't want to see. What it was in the time of Isaiah's day. So we're all rebel subjects, absolutely. First thing Isaiah knows. The second thing he knows 700 years in advance is that these rebel subjects are going to reject the servant when he comes. Tom's going to be talking more about that in just a minute. He says that this servant is going to be oppressed. The idea behind oppression is it comes from the Old Testament. It's what taskmasters do to make the lives of their slaves miserable. It's the idea of adding, of telling the slaves, you have to make bricks without straw. In other words, they're making life harder, more stressful, more tension, and more oppression to those slaves. And Jesus experienced this kind of oppression throughout his ministry to the Jews. It wasn't just the last week of his life when he was put on trial. Throughout, wherever he went, the leaders oppressed him, trying to get after him, trying to attack him. You know that Jesus, he was always saying to people, don't tell them I healed you, don't tell them I did this, right? Because he knew as soon as the leaders heard, they would be trying to look for ways to kill him and remove him. So Jesus lived with oppression constantly, the stress of the ministry and what he was about to do. It says he was afflicted. This is the idea of being humiliated, brought low. You're treated with contempt, being shamed, belittled, scorned, jest, mockery, all of that. The gall that Jesus was given when he hung on the cross was just one example of the affliction that he really bore throughout. Third, it says he would be taken like a lamb to the slaughter. The slaughter doesn't come here. It comes in verse 8. Here he's just led to it. You know, it would be a terrifying thing. I'm a big reader of police mysteries, so, you know, all that. And I know from reading these books, it's one thing if you're taken to jail, you're taken to the police station, and you're interrogated, but you know you're an innocent person, and you know that when you walk out of there, you're walking back into freedom. Jesus knew that he would not be walking out a free man. He knew it, and he went in willingly. And fourth, it said that he would be like a lamb being sheared. He was stripped of his clothes, of his friends, his honor, and his divine protection. Nobody was more naked than Jesus was when he went to Golgotha on Good Friday. All right. So that was the second thing. He knew he'd be rejected. The third thing Isaiah knows about the coming servant and Messiah is that although he would be rejected and people thought he failed in what he was doing, Isaiah knew that he was actually succeeding in what he came to do. Jesus knew that he was supposed to come as a ransom and a substitute for the rebel subjects. The fourth thing that Isaiah knew, we're not really going to be talking about this tonight, but he knew that the sight of the subjects would be restored. In other words, he knew that when Jesus came, when he died, when he rose again, and when the Holy Spirit would be given, that the Holy Spirit would open the eyes of people to see who he was. Because alone on our own, no rebel subject can really see the exalted king. It takes a special opening of the eyes. And Isaiah knew that that day would be coming too. And then finally, Isaiah knows that as a result of all of this, it says that kings of the earth would shut their mouths before him in reverent silence. There is not a lot of silence in the Bible. In fact, Jesus said, right, even if you don't say anything, the rocks and the stones will cry out. The normal course of events, of course, is to exalt the king, to exalt God, and to cry out and to praise. But he said there would be a time when people will just be so stunned at what this servant has done that all they can do is just open their mouths and be silent and reverent. So those are the 5 things that Isaiah knew specifically about the servant who was to come. And I think with that, Tom wants to tell you the 8 things that the servant actually does for the people.
All right. Thank you, Kathrine. She's pretty good, isn't she? Yeah. All right. Okay, so again, this Isaiah 53, if you get a chance maybe during the week to go ahead and leave that open to the chapter. And to ruminate over, every sentence has something very beautiful and meaningful. So these are just some highlights about what Jesus, the servant, has done. And for those of you curious about the video, where that ends up going, I mean, as the interviews consider, is finally the guy doing those interviews asks all those people, well, who does this resemble? Who is this person? Do you think anybody that resembles? And a few of them say, well, yeah, it sounds a lot like Jesus. And then they say, but well, we don't believe in him. And so it's kind of like, okay. So if we have time, maybe we'll show you the last 3 minutes of it. The first point is, and in chapter 11 reads like this. It says, by his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many. And it's curious that Isaiah says that the servant had full knowledge of what was going to happen. John, in his gospel, Jesus says, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down. I give it of my own free will. And so the servant passage is not God the Father arbitrarily picking somebody and saying, I'm going to mess with you for my purposes, like the servant was a pawn. He was fully aware. It was part of the plan. It was God's will and the servant cooperating together to bring about healing and redemption. So the servant knew God's purposes and led himself, Jesus Christ, obviously, for that purpose. And you know how difficult from the New Testament, the Gospels, when Jesus starts letting his disciples know about this, they first of them, they didn't really understand it, but when it started to soak in, he starts saying, now guys, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to get crucified. And they didn't like that, and some of them didn't understand it, but when it dawned on them, they rejected it. They said, no, that can't happen. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to come and conquer, kick the Romans out, and give us our nation back. And the second thing the servant does, which really is the very center of the chapter, and you can say it's the center of everything for Christianity. Kathrine and I were talking a little bit. What does the average person think Christianity is? And what does the average church-going person that says they're a Christian thinks Christianity is? And I'm sure you'd get some different answers. You see, if you turn the TV on and listen to sermons, there's many different brands of Christianity. But the second point here is verse 12. He poured out his soul to death. The servant died. It wasn't just he was afflicted, he had a hard time, he got sick. The servant was willing to die. He poured himself out to death. And in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says that Jesus, being equal with God, didn't grasp onto that, but he humbled himself, taking the form of a servant and becoming obedient even to death. And then, of course, God highly exalted him so that every knee should bow to him. He poured himself out to death, totally obedient. That's the very center of things. That's what Christianity rests on. And then corollary to that, the last line of verse 12 says this, yet he himself bore the sin of many. And the last line of verse 11, he will bear their iniquities. Wow. This is 700 years before Jesus. I wonder if some of those Israeli secular Jews that were listening to those verses, what was burning in their heart as they heard that somebody, their Messiah, needs to die for their sins. And that's really at the heart. I mean, the text says it was the Lord's will to crush him, not because of his own sins. It says there was no deceit in his mouth. Hebrews said Jesus was tempted and suffered in every way just as we do, yet without sin. That's the one qualification. To bear, to take our place, to do what we couldn't do, to die in our place. That is the very center of Christianity. That's not what a lot of people are preaching today. A lot of people are preaching that, if you just have faith. Well, faith in what? Faith, what does it rest on? What is it? Well, it's positive. It's positive focus, and God will bless you. God will prosper you. He wants good things for you. Well, how do we get the good? Well, you can't have it without this singular, important death. It's the only death that really matters for eternity. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:4 that Jesus rose from the dead, and then he says, according to the Scriptures, if you read that. Well, what Scriptures? Paul didn't have 1 Corinthians. He's writing it. In fact, he probably didn't know that we'd be reading it. Maybe he did. I don't know. But as the letters began to, God worked through the letters, of course, the church decided that these were directly inspired by him. So what scriptures? Well, I can't help but think Paul would have Isaiah 53 in mind as one of the core places that talk about the resurrection. And he says here in verse 10 here. Light of life. Yeah, it's verse 11 here. This is a resurrection here. It says, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Well, what was the suffering of his soul? Well, we just heard that it was ended in death. So how do you see the light of life when you're dead? Only one way I can think about is that you are raised from the dead, which, of course, we know from the New Testament is what happened with Jesus. So here we have 700 years in advance what this Messiah would be. The servant arose from the dead. Number 5 is a beautiful thing as well, and that is the last line of verse 12. He bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. He interceded. Well, interceded means to pray for somebody or to come in and help somebody. And we know from the letter of Hebrews that Jesus does this, that he stands before the throne of God interceding for us and on our behalf. So when the devil goes before God and says, hey, how could Tom be one of your followers? Look what he did. Look what he's thinking. And Jesus stands there and said, yes, I know, but I've paid for that. I have to remind you, devil, it's all been paid for. He's one of mine. You can't touch him. Yeah, we'll let you harass him a bit, but we're going to work good out of that. But you can't have his soul because he's safe. And Jesus intercedes. And here in Isaiah, we have a prophecy about him doing just that. So it's encouraging to me to think that, often we think we are called to prayer, but do you ever stop to think that Jesus prays for you? I mean, that's pretty staggering to think that. And if he prays for me, I'm prayed for. Good things are going to happen. So the servant intercedes for transgressors, and I am one of them. The next point, number 6 out of my 8 here, is verse 11. My servant, we just read the latter part of it. He will justify many. Now, Paul talks a lot about justify and justification, and what this means. This means a couple of things. It means to make you righteous. I mean, to really make you righteous. God wants to make us, to change us, but it also means to declare you righteous. Now, the making us righteous happens over time, because I'm not quite there yet. Are you? I mean, we're not.
I can validate.
Yeah. Don't ask her to say anything more about me. But she knows. She knows how frail I am and how fickle life can be. So God is making us. But to declare you righteous is something he does when you're justified. It's a legal term in the New. Paul uses it, takes it out of the legal arena, and says it basically means you acquit somebody, you set them free, you pardon. Actually, the pardon, President Obama just pardoned 54 people. I always cringe when I wonder, they had some website so you can look up who these people are and what they did. But presidents do this, and it's a custom a lot of times right before they leave office to pardon a whole bunch of people. And you wonder how that all gets done, if these people were connected to some special interest, and I don't know, but you can only speculate it. But to be justified means to be declared righteous once and for all, so that when God looks at you, he's not seeing the body of sin, but he's seeing you as a cleansed, holy, righteous, accepted, justified person. And becoming righteous is the process that happens from day to day.